I think a lot of people might look at this too linear and see like, skiing is what saved him. And that's almost my issue with the title in a way, because skiing really, it saved me, but it's not to say that skiing will save everybody.
Yeah.
This isn't the book that says take your kids skiing. I think my takeaways are, if you're passionate about something, you can get through anything. When I was in the hospital and I was at my absolute worst, Dad told me every day, when we get out of this, we're going to go skiing. And just the thought of getting to do what I loved again was what I held on to. And I held on to that through the whole process. And when you find that passion, it'll drive who you're going to be, and it'll fit what your strengths are. And when you find a way to use your strengths and do what's going to make you happy, you're going to find your place in the world. And no matter what your circumstances are, you can find that.
Welcome to the Good Life Coach podcast. I am your host, Michelle Lamoureux. The intention of this show is to awaken you to your fullest potential. Join me each week for inspiring interviews to elevate an area of your life, as well as interviews with women entrepreneurs who are creating success on their own terms. Each episode provides actionable tips to guide you to design a life you love. Hey friends, it's Michelle Lamoureux and welcome back to the Good Life Coach podcast. Today, I'm actually interviewing two people, Rob and Ryan DeLena. They are the co-authors of Without Restraint, How Skiing Saved My Son's Life. And Rob is the father, his son is Ryan. And this is a memoir that's coming out in March of next year, of 2023. Now, normally I've had an opportunity to read a book before I do an interview, but this doesn't have an advanced copy yet. So you are going to be going on the journey with me as I interview them. But this is how it's described on Amazon. As a child, Ryan DeLena had difficulty controlling his emotional outbursts. This led to placement in the therapeutic schools that relied on detrimental methods of behavior modification, such as physical restraint. Nothing helped, from a team of doctors to heavy medication. Then in 2010, Ryan was voluntarily committed to a mental hospital for further evaluation. His parents, Rob and Mary Beth, were counseled to place him in a group home, and they refused. So what you're going to hear today is their journey of how skiing actually is what led Rob and his wife ultimately to realize that the therapeutic model was not working for Ryan, their son. And what I appreciated about this conversation was that Ryan was a part of it, and we get to hear his dad's perspective and what he was thinking and how they chose to navigate the therapeutic schools and what was being advised to them as parents, and then Ryan's experience as a child and how it impacted him mentally. Just a little bit about Rob. He was an attorney and for over 20 years has been running a small recruiting company called Legal Staffing Solutions, and Ryan is a junior at Northern Vermont University studying outdoor education, and you will hear how skiing and finding his passion for adventuring, to use his words, gave him a sense of purpose and rescued him from a situation that created a lot of trauma in his life. So it's a really powerful story, and I hope that you enjoy it. This is a podcast interview, which is for entertainment purposes only. What you're hearing today is not intended to be mental health advice or any sort of health advice. For that, you should seek counsel from your own trusted healthcare providers. But this is, in fact, their story, their journey that they wanted to share. So let's get into the show. We have an interesting story for you today. It's a father-son journey of navigating the therapeutic educational system and the medical system when your child doesn't fit into what's considered the norm. And joining us today is Rob and Ryan DeLena, and they are the authors of Without Restraint, How Skiing Saved My Son's Life. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Yes. So just a little backstory quickly. Rob and I worked together in a previous life when he was an attorney at the law firm that I did marketing for. And we just reconnected when he told me about his book that he's written.
We both ended up in different places, but
we did.
It was a good place to start.
It was a great place to start. For sure, it was a great place to start. And I think that's part of what we're talking about is just everyone's journey becomes unique in this idea that, you go to school and then you get your degree and then you get married and then you have the kid and they have to go through this perfect formulaic path. It can maybe set people up. And this was a bit of your situation, wasn't it, Rob? Can you take us into your story a bit of how, what started here?
Sure. You just described central casting for me. I mean, I think I was a kid. I grew up in Revere, Mass, which, if you don't know, is sort of a blue collar town, and we lived near the airport. And my mom worked at the airport. My dad was worked for the state and worked at nights at Boston Garden, parking cars. And I went on to law school, and I've done well. My wife went to Trinity College, same college as me, and we were both college athletes. And we moved out to Sudbury, which is, a well-to-do town where it's filled with doctors and lawyers and finance people, and the pressure on kids is enormous. And I think when Ryan was born, I fully expected, him to play second base for Harvard. I just, I didn't think he'd maybe make it to the pros, but I thought he would play college sports and he would start by dominating Little League and go on from there. And when he struggled initially, I think it was easy to look and say, okay, somebody can fix him. We'll go to the right doctor, or we'll go to the right school, and, we'll get right back on track. And I think that led us to some really, bad places and made some really bad decisions up until the point when, he completely bottomed out. And, I don't want to skip ahead, but he, ended up in a mental hospital for a couple of weeks and was on a medicine that he had a terrible side effect. And, at some point I just woke up and said, all that really matters is his happiness. I don't care, anything, I don't care about anything else. Just want to be happy for 5 minutes. And when I reached that point, I think I recalibrated his expectations for him, and it changed me in the process as well. I mean, you look at life a little differently, and I stopped worrying about, what everybody thought. And I just wanted things to be good for him. And we happened to start skiing around that same time. And, again, I don't want to skip ahead, but it led us to a much different path, thank goodness.
Well, take us into what was going on, because one of the things that I read in the bio was how Ryan was restrained at the young age of 3. So what was Ryan like as a little boy? Like, how did he end up in this system at such a, as a toddler, essentially?
That's a great question. So Ryan was, he was a rambunctious kid. He was very smart. He learned language really early on. He talked really early on. He was, I'll use the word diagnosed, but we had a preschool tell us he was gifted at one point. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound so bad. But he was always defiant. I mean, I remember a questionnaire we filled out for one doctor, when is Ryan the happiest? And he was the happiest when he was doing what he wasn't supposed to do. He just loved, poking at that authority, and he would laugh all along the way. That was fun at home. And I worked with that, and I would chase him up the stairs and pretend I was mad, and he would laugh and I would laugh. But when you get in a public school setting and you can't, or you won't comply, all of a sudden they have to discipline you. And when you're really young age, it's really hard to discipline a kid. So we started at a preschool in Sudbury that was, sort of a well-to-do preschool. And it was the one everybody tried to get on the list for. And Ryan went to a summer camp before the preschool started, and he lasted one day. And the preschool director asked us to stay or come back the next day. And then she wanted to have a pediatric neuropsychiatrist observe him, which we were sort of taken aback by, but, we said fine. And so this neuropsychiatrist observed him the next day for a couple of hours, met with us, and she took out a yellow legal pad and drew a circle. And then she bisected the circle, and she said, Ryan is really strong on the left half of his brain. And he's really weak on the right half. That imbalance creates uncertainty. And he's that's a lot of his struggles sort of stem from there. And she advised us to put him in, the town had an integrated preschool, which is a mix of neurotypical kids and kids that were struggling, mostly developmentally delayed. There really weren't kids like Ryan that were just, defiant. So he starts at this integrated preschool, and he has one good year there. And then at the end of that year, he was still too young for kindergarten. And in the book, I described this as mistake number 1. We were advised to repeat the program again. And we decided to do that. But for a linear kid like Ryan, that year starts at point A and ends at point B.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, he goes back the next year and he goes right back to point A again. And we never took the time to explain to him what was going on. And he just unraveled in that second year. Ryan, you want to say something about, you remember that part of repeating that program?
Yeah, I don't remember too much of it. I definitely remember being older, but I remember what it was like. And I wasn't a kid who liked to sit still, and I wasn't a kid who learned by people talking at me. And I'm realizing now I probably had a lot of ADHD my whole life. So I feel like I lived in my own world a lot. I lived in my own thoughts. And essentially, whenever I got bored, I would just stand up and walk around. And I don't remember anybody ever telling me that was bad. I just remember somebody standing up and walking around with me. And I'm like, cool, this is just what preschool is like, I guess. You just walk around and people walk around with you. I kind of knew I wasn't supposed to be doing it, but nothing bad ever happened. But behind the scenes, people were taking note of that and sort of planning the next step. And had I known what the next step is, and had I been old enough to process it, I probably would have sat still.
Yeah, but you were also 3 or 4 years old. So this is where the system does sound like, the fact that they were doing neuropsych evaluations on a 3-year-old makes me feel like the person who did that probably should have had a neuropsych evaluation, in my opinion. That seems ridiculous. Kids at that age, especially, not just, generalized, but boys who have a lot of energy and need to move, or maybe are a little more sporty or whatever, I think that's pretty normal.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So that must have been so frustrating. But when you have these experts and you've got this, school that everyone's trying to get into, and they're telling you, oh, we need to do this in good faith, you're like, oh, they should know better, right, Rob? I mean, is that kind of where your head was at
and
that
that's
time?
What happened. So the neuropsychiatrist was super smart. She's one of the most impressive people I'd ever been, around. I mean, she would come in for 15 minutes and observe him, or an hour and observe him, especially in that second year when he was repeating the program, and say, he's regressed. Things are going south here. He can't go to public kindergarten. And she recommended.
Mean to laugh. Was he 4?
4. I mean, maybe 5.
It's not funny. It makes me so uncomfortable, Ryan, that's why I'm like.
I think you're laughing at me. It's funny too.
No, it's true.
To the entire outcome of a kid's life based on how they play when they're 4 years old. It's kind of outrageous to me, because you think of how many things in your life altered how you negotiate the world and how you perceive things. So many things can change, but they're trying to take one red flag and assuming it will spiral at each of these steps and you won't be a functional adult, 10, 20 years down the line.
Right. Yep. Can I just ask, so you do talk about, you were, I believe, 3 years old. Were you at the summer program or something where the woman tackled you? Can you tell that story? And Rob, I'd love to just.
So let me set it up.
Yeah, please.
When year 2 sort of falls apart at the integrated preschool, which was in part of our town, okay. She then recommends this private placement, a therapeutic school. I won't say the name, and we changed all the names in the book. That was known. It was described to us in their marketing materials as a holding environment, and they write in the first part of their literature on their website. They talk about a holding environment. It was described to us as when kids get dysregulated, they would hug them. And I think for kids who are nonverbal and they have trouble communicating, there is probably studies that show touch can help, right? It does help to sort of decompress them. So we went into it thinking, okay, that sounds plausible.
Yeah, he'll be held like hugged. Hugged is
held like hugged. Yep.
Yes. Okay.
And they trained us how to do it. So anyway, then I'll skip ahead. So we then make the decision he's going to go to this school. At some point, a woman from the school came to observe Ryan at the integrated preschool to tell him he was going to go to this new place in the fall. And I'll let Ryan pick up the story because it's a good one.
Yeah. So essentially, like I said, whenever I got up, did something, somebody would just kind of walk around with me and talk to me. So that was a little bit of what I was used to. And at this time, I hadn't really had any majorly negative experiences in my life. I think back on my memories and it's typical kid memories, playing in the backyard, opening presents on Christmas, dad flipping a burger on the grill. It's this is the first really bad thing that had happened to me. And I think it was a pretty big loss of innocence moment for me. So this lady from the school I was heading to, she comes to observe me, and I was told it was just, she was going to meet me and talk with her a little bit. And I sort of expressed a little bit of disappointment, how I didn't want to leave my school. I liked that I had some friends there. But we go into this room at recess, and everything's going pretty normal up to this point. And I'm playing with these big foam dice. And everything went fine until I had to put away the foam dice. And I was just like, I don't want to put away the foam dice. And I was like sort of resisting when she was trying to take them out of my hand. And instead of just like playing the game with me at this point, she grabs one of my arms and puts it behind my back and then like rips the foam dice out of my hand. And I'm kind of startled because I don't know what's happening. And my most natural reaction is to try and fight her off because I can feel sort of the grip of her nails like digging into my arm and it hurts. So I try and fight her off. And at this point, she gets my other arm and pins me right to the floor. And I am freaking out. And the more I struggle, the more force she applies. And this is another part I remember vividly. One of the other staff members who worked at the preschool, who was kind of walking around with me, was just kind of standing there. So I didn't really process it as like, oh, I'm being attacked. I knew because she was standing there that like this was a thing that was supposed to happen. This was a punishment. And I just kept fighting and fighting. The more it hurt until eventually I just got too tired and I just kind of laid down. And then she just kind of got up and we went on with the rest of the day. Like nothing happened. But I knew since she was from this new school and she just did this awful thing to me, I kind of knew everything was about to change. I knew this new school was not going to be a good thing and that this was going to be a regular thing when I went there.
So sorry, Ryan. And she said to you, are you ready to feel safe when she was restraining you?
Yeah, she kept being like, are you ready to feel safe? And I just didn't know what that meant at that point. And I learned throughout school, are you ready to feel safe meant, are you ready to stop resisting? Are you ready
to comply?
Yeah. You know, anytime I fought back, they were like, are you ready to feel safe? Are you ready to be safe? They meant, are you ready to stop trying to escape and stop trying to move and just listen?
How old were you, Ryan, when that happened?
I think I was probably around
five, I think. Mm-hmm. Maybe just 5. Yeah, I think
and
you went to
Rob, did they tell
6.
you what they had done? Did you?
No, I didn't hear this story until we wrote the book. I mean it. I swear. He
I
never
believe.
Talked
Oh my goodness, I'm sure he was probably so scared too.
I was just flabbergasted because I didn't know that at all. And I think back to we felt good about the decision to put him in this place. I mean, like I said, the neuropsychiatrist was really smart and she knew the system well. And we wanted a place that was in the suburbs near us. It was, just because he wouldn't be in the van for an hour or two. And, it would draw from, he might have some friends because there would be some Sudbury kids. And when you looked at the place, it looked like a suburban private school. It had a barn and, everything looked good. And it just, I think while he was being restrained in those first few years, and we were the first couple of years, especially, he was so young. If he came home and said, how was your day, Ryan? It says you had 3 restraints. You must have acted up. We were angry with him. And then he would say, they try to kill me. They're trying to strangle me. And we'd say, come on, it's not that bad. Maybe if you had just listened, you wouldn't have gotten that restraint. And we were sort of on the school side in the beginning, which I have tremendous guilt about. I mean, I hate even saying.
We all do the best that we can with information. Ryan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that was the part I remember most vividly was every day I went home and I would talk about this. And I would just be like, Dad, like, I couldn't breathe. I got a rug burn. I got a bruise. Like, they're trying to hurt me. I don't get it. And part of it was I was having a hard time articulating what was happening because I was explaining it like a kid would. So, of course, when I would come home, I would tell him what happened, but I would explain it like a kid would. And of course, what do kids do? They exaggerate and they tell tall tales and you don't know what's true and what's not. And I would try and explain how what they were doing was hurting me, but I didn't know how to articulate it in a way that would make sense to him. So of course, he probably was hearing it as though I just didn't like that I was being punished. But what I was trying to say is like, when I go to school, they're hurting me. Like when they put me on the ground, like I can't breathe sometimes, I get rug burns, like it's painful. Like, why do I have to do this? And, like he said, he would just assume it was my fault,
Yeah. And when you said you couldn't breathe, one of the things you mentioned, that woman who tackled you essentially and held you down, she also covered your mouth.
So sometimes if you were screaming, they would cover your mouth so you wouldn't disrupt other classes.
Oh my God. It's, again, I'm laughing out of discomfort.
It's bizarre.
Not
I
out
know.
of, there's
I
nothing
know.
funny about this. Just
I know.
complete discomfort. What was so you keep saying this woman was smart, the first woman who did the neuropsych evaluation when he was like 3. What did they diagnose him with? Why was he recommended to go through into the system? What was the actual
Great
diagnosis?
question. So that's a great question. So I tell the story in the book after, and I'll back up a little. Once we sort of identified that he was going to go to the integrated preschool, and after she observed him and drew the circle and said that he was different, essentially, she did do educational testing on him, which determined some deficits. He was super strong in some areas and really weak in other areas. Most of which was like typically if you were spectrum-y, reading people's emotions and things like that. But again, he was 4 years old when he took the test, so it's really hard to determine if the results are accurate. She then, I remember we were sitting in her office and she takes out the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, which is this huge thick book, looks like a telephone book. And she starts thumbing through it. And she said, in order to get services from the town, in other words, in order for the town to pay for everything, we need a diagnosis. So we have to tell them something. And she would go through and she would stop and look and scratch her head and no, and then she'd go through again. And then finally she nods and she says, that's PDD-NOS, a pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So if you think about that, it's pervasive, it's a developmental disorder, but we really don't know what it is. It's the diagnosis.
So it wasn't ADHD. It wasn't ADHD. Ryan, do you think it was ADHD?
No.
What?
I'm very certain of it, and my
You think it was or not?
I do. I do think it was ADHD.
Yeah.
And then my therapist has confirmed with me now. He's like, yeah, you definitely have some ADHD. And the only reason that we didn't medicate it later on is that the medication would have interfered with your ability to be energetic and do the adventure sports you like to do. So that's probably what I had. I remember my dad telling me that they tried Ritalin and it made me more hyper. So they just assumed it didn't work. But there was other things going on beyond my ability to pay attention. When I was a kid, I had an insane amount of memory. The story I always like to tell is my dad had me doing like the Gettysburg Address, the Pledge of Allegiance, movie scenes. I could repeat anything word for word. And that's been the case for me my whole life. Anything that goes in sequence, if I can remember one part, I'll remember the rest. In fact, I just had an assignment where I had to list every rock climb I've ever done. And I could a lot of the moves and like what I was feeling, what I was doing on every single rock climb that I've done for the past 4 years.
Wow. That's amazing.
I'm really strong with memory, but I was really weak with other things. So I think that was going on too.
Got it.
And Michelle, he was a volatile kid. I mean, Ryan was my wife used to say a 0 or a 10 kid. If things were great, it was perfect, then he was a 10. And if one little thing went awry, he would melt down, and he was difficult. He was the kid. When we walked into a birthday party, when the other parents would roll their eyes and groan because he had the ability to cause disruption. And I think in a public school setting, had we left him in, and we should have, he would have gotten in trouble a lot. He would have been in the principal's office constantly, but he wouldn't have been tackled every day. And that's the mistake we made, I think.
Right. But understandably too. And I have other friends whose children are the ones that, disrupt or whatever, and they feel embarrassment or like, oh, they have to pause, and they don't know how to navigate. And they also want their child to feel balanced. And so they're looking for answers. They're seeking out those experts because they just want their child to feel like, to be able to assimilate to some degree into whatever setting that they're doing in a way that is socially acceptable. Right. I mean, that's the world we live in.
Sure.
Yeah. There's no judgment here. What was your wife thinking about all this? Was she on the same page?
So, my wife is really a classic type A. I mean, I'm sort of type A, but I'm Italian, so I definitely fly by the seat of my pants sometimes and go with my gut. She really admires hierarchy and process, and she's made a career of it. And I think she just reflexively wanted to listen to the experts, and they knew more than we did. Yeah. And that was true on paper. And it just took a few examples where I would just look and just logically say, they're wrong about this. And not only, maybe they're not even wrong, but they've only thought about this for that 15 minutes when they met with us, and then they moved on to another patient. They're human beings. They're not infallible. So I think for her, it was a struggle to go against conventional wisdom. And it took a long time. And then just to sort of advance the story, I mean, a lot of I worked at home during this period. My wife worked in Cambridge. So I was the one that was forced to do a lot of the restraints early on. And we had a nanny who was trained in ABA therapy and the restraints. So I would watch her do the
therapy. I'm sorry, what
applied
is that?
Applied behavioral analysis.
Okay.
It's sort of hard to define, but it's the go-to, I think, with special needs kids. And it's a terrible analogy, but it's almost like training a dog. I mean, it's reward and punishment all the way through. And, they grow up in this culture, they're taught this, and, they can be great. They can use positive charts and sticker charts and all of these things when kids have trouble communicating, that they look and see, a smiley face and that's a good thing, or a frowny face and it's a bad thing. I just think the second you start putting your hands on a kid, it all goes out the window. And I would watch her do these restraints over silly little things, and it would go on for an hour. And as Ryan got bigger, he was stronger, and they would wrestle on the floor for 20 minutes, and he would be crying and rug burns. And if I asked him in that moment, what did you do wrong to start the restraint? I don't think he could have told me, and I'm not sure the nanny could have told me. I mean, it devolves so quickly into a physical conflict where, one side is going to win. And when I would restrain him early, when he was little, I mean, I could use my finger and just press him to the floor, and it wasn't as bad. But as he got bigger, I'm a man, and my adrenaline would start pumping, and I was going to win that wrestling match. And I would leave that confrontation and say, this is just terrible. And I would tell my wife about it when she got home, but 5 hours later, it's lost in that. And, on weekends, she'd have to do it. And I think she'd get a little taste of it. And then just one example we had was our nanny ended up having a baby and leaving. And we couldn't find an ABA trained nanny quickly. So we replaced her for a year with a woman who was heading to medical school, had no formal training in this. And she just sort of relied on instinct and humor. And I would see throughout the day, she restrained him hardly ever. And it's just kind of the little spark of like, are we doing the right thing here? This seems crazy. And little by little, we stopped restraining him at home. The problem is we could never get the school to stop. And we had a tough time. We started looking at other programs, but once he went to a therapeutic school that restrained him and he had a one-to-one aide, no other school would accept him other than a place that was much like the place we were at. And that was, we were left scratching our heads at what to do.
Kind of what I was talking about was sort of the system being broken. And with each step, they sort of take away more of your freedom. What they don't tell you, the town pays for it, so it doesn't cost you anything out of pocket. So when they're like, oh, do you want to give them a one-to-one aid? You're like, sure.
Right. Amazing. Good. Right. Private tutor, right? Yeah, sure.
And then when that school goes wrong, if you have to leave for any reason, if there's a school that doesn't offer you a one-to-one aid, you can't go to that school. They're like, well, you can go to this other program for a year first before you come here. And once he's demonstrated he can do it without a one-to-one aid, you can come back. But at this point, I was already so damaged from what was happening to me. There was no way I was going to make it through a year program and prove it to them. So you're kind of trapped. It's almost like having a felony on your record. Once you have the restraints and once you have certain accommodations on your record, schools will look at you and turn you away without a second thought.
Wow. At what point? So this nanny came in. What was different about that interaction? And can you articulate, did you feel a difference or?
I knew she was a good person and I never associated her with what was going on at school. But she was definitely rough with me. I know she would not let the smallest things slide. I tried to turn a little cartwheel one time. There was a little stroller hanging in the garage. And when I was very little, it kind of bothered me that one of the wheels would be crooked and I would fix it. And just because she didn't like that I always had to walk by it and fix the wheel, strained me until I gave up on trying to fix the wheel. It was totally different. I just remember I would come home and me and would play card games, and she taught me math, which was crazy. She was super smart. And at this time I figured out I was good at math, and anything that I was good at, it made me feel good to be good at something. So I would have her show me math. So I was 8 years old and she's showing me how algebra works. And I'm just I don't know. I just have really fun memories. She also skied, and we talked a lot about skiing. So I connected with her, but there was never any conflict there. There was never tension. I was never scared of her. It was fun.
Yeah, she let you basically be a kid more. It sounded like too. She just let him
It's true. It's
You
true.
know,
But
fidget.
exactly. She didn't have the playbook, and I feel badly. The first nanny, and we changed their names in the book, but
Yeah.
she was hired to do exactly what she did. We asked her to do this ABA, applied behavioral analysis, restrain him when he acts up, and she did exactly what she was supposed to do.
She was doing her job, and probably as well as she, the fact that she wasn't letting anything fly, she probably felt good about that.
At it. She taught Ryan to read. She did a lot of great things. And then when she came back after her maternity leave, and at this point I said, I don't want to restrain Ryan anymore in the house. You have to find a new way. She did. She just totally changed.
Yeah, she was just doing her job.
Yeah,
she was just doing her job. What were they afraid of? What's the idea of the restraint? Like, was it just to get him to be calm? Like, what was the objective?
It becomes a punishment, I think. I think if you say, Ryan, you need to put your toys away, or Ryan, don't knock over Abigail.
So it's like timeout times 1,000.
Yeah. Right? Start with a timeout. Yes. Yeah. You start with a timeout, and then when he refused to go into the timeout, and remember, he was defiant anyway. Yeah. Ryan, you have to do a timeout. I'm not doing a timeout. Now you're the grown-up, and your next play is to grab him. That's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. And I wish we just said, do we really care that he knocked over Abigail's, clock tower,
Right. Is that his sister?
Yeah.
Okay.
By something here. There's a major difference between school number 1 and all the schools after that. And, the laws have changed on restraints, and, I like to believe that that's a good thing, but schools are always going to do things behind the scenes. And I know that this school, and I'm trying hard not to name them, just conversational. I know that they definitely were not supposed to be doing this the way they were doing. All of the other schools, it was a last resort. If you were going to try from a staff member and they had to grab you, or if you were going to try and hurt somebody, they were going to grab you. At this school, I remember I knocked over a snowman that some kid made. I didn't even see the kid make the snowman. I didn't have any vendetta against him. I just felt like knocking something over, I'm a boy. That's how it goes. And I remember this one staff member, he pulled me aside and he's like, when we get back to class, we're going to do a very long hold. And then he walked me back to class, arm around my wrist, not even right there. It wasn't even heat of the moment. It was premeditated. And I had to walk down this long hill that took 20 minutes to walk down, knowing the second I got back in, I was going to be on the floor for 10 minutes. And then totally calmly, not resisting, I walked into the classroom and he put me on the floor for 10 whole minutes. It was a punishment. They were totally abusing their power to do it.
We don't know, Michelle. In 2015, the rules changed in Massachusetts, and they're no longer allowed. Prone restraints, the face down ones, are really restricted, and only in extreme circumstances. And there's a whole bunch of criteria they have to jump through to even be able to be allowed to do it. But you're no longer supposed to use restraint as a punishment. Now, just to put into context, this is pre that rule, and this school was designed around using restraint as a punishment. So I think
it was their whole philosophy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And also probably there's been a lot of parents who complained or had different awareness or really can't you do it a different way? Because they probably went in with good intentions like you did too, Rob, and your wife, where you're yeah, he's rowdy, this is going to help him one-to-one, evaluation and all of this added on, you think it's a positive. And then, the more you're in it, you're wait a second, this isn't feeling right. Your intuition started speaking to you. Yep. Right. And your gut was So the nanny came in, you started seeing stuff. And then where did the skiing come into play?
So right around 2009, he's still at the first school.
Tell us how old he is, because I think just having a sense of age is important in this.
You were 7, right? You'll turn 8 in May of that year. So you were 7 years old. And I used to describe weekends at our house as 48 hours of hell because, Ryan was really hard to keep busy and he inevitably had conflict with his sister. And my whole job was to keep him busy. And we would go to Home Depot for hours and walk around. We would just do anything to keep him busy. And we didn't have, really a winter activity at all. And winters, in New England are cold and there's not much you can do outside. So it was during Christmas break and I don't remember why exactly, but I know he did something, and I had to separate him from his sister. And I just tossed him in the car with a coat and gloves and a hat. And I think I grabbed his bike helmet, and we drove to Neshoba Valley, which is this little ski hill about 45 minutes from our house. And all of a sudden we were there, and I can let Ryan maybe take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So skiing was funny because he didn't really ski for about 20 years. And even when he did ski, he wasn't like a pro skier. He was probably at the same level I was when he hopped on the magic carpet. The only thing I knew about skiing is I saw someone do it in Curious George. So I was asking him, like, how do they stay on your feet? And he's like, oh, there's special boots. And, I just remember going in a long line. I kind of hated lines. I put these really uncomfortable boots on. I put the skis on, and I'm like, oh, what do you do in skiing? I'm picturing this Curious George thing in my head. I'm like, you go down the hill. So we go up the magic carpet, and I think he wanted to explain something to me, but I just kind of went off. And this is sort of the coolest thing about it, is I just kind of had a natural ability to ski sort of right away. So I went down the hill, and I ended up instructing here years later. So I've seen all of the scenarios in which this goes wrong. And somehow it went right. I went straight down the hill, and I just kind of looked at the line because I knew I needed to get back in line to go up the magic carpet again. And I made like a perfect little J turn. And I just smiled. I was like, that was fun. That was cool. And we just did that over and over again.
And so, Rob, what were you observing with Ryan?
So I never thought we would get that far, because when he says he hated lines, I mean, Ryan wouldn't wait for anything. If I walked to an ice cream store or stand and there was a line, I would pay people to let us cut. I mean, he could never wait for anything. So I hadn't skied in a long, long time, but I know there's lift lines, and the process for renting your boots and equipment is tedious and slow. I never thought we would get to the point where we would actually be standing on the snow. And then when we finally got off the magic carpet, it sort of hit me like, geez, I didn't tell him anything about how to ski. I don't really even know what to tell him at this point. And I started to explain to him how to slow down or stop. And he just looked at me and just shot down the hill. And I went, and I just was, everybody falls that first minute or two, the first second or two. And he didn't. And I just said, oh, and then I had to go down, and I barely made it down. I hadn't skied in a long time. And we had to wait in a little line to go back up again. And he tolerated the line. And it was different. That was something I hadn't seen. And we had a great couple of hours.
The thing that I would say about that is it's almost like skiing was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that. And I think one of the things that you learn about in the mountains, and I learned this over many years, is just sort of the process of patience and reward. I hated lines because I hated waiting, because I just didn't get the point to it. I'm just like, we're here forever, and for what? And I think skiing was one of the first places I processed, like, waiting in this line means I get to do the thing that makes me really happy. So I didn't care that there was 20 kids in front of me at the magic carpet, because it just meant as soon as I got there, I got to ski again. And I think as soon as that got introduced, I started to demonstrate concepts of just being a regular human that people, when I was 4, assumed I would never be able to achieve in my life.
Yeah,
wow.
That's true.
Wow. So this was the beginning of it, though, right, Rob? Because skiing saved your son's life. So how? Yep. So tell us how this evolved.
We went back the next day, and I hired an instructor, because I couldn't teach him how to stop or slow down. He would ski until he landed in the parking lot. Like sparks would come off the skis. I'm like, all right, we have to stop that. And so she takes him off for an hour, and I did a couple of runs myself. I probably went in the bathroom for a little break. And when they came back, he skied with her, and he did this little stop, and he sprayed me with snow. And I was like, oh, that was pretty good. And she said, we just came down the expert run. And, the expert runs there are small, but nobody skis the expert run on their second
not
day.
Your first time out. No.
So, I mean, I don't know, you remember that, Ryan?
That one's really vivid. I mean, I guess, skiing, this is when I started to realize I really liked skiing, because I guess the thing that I would say, he talks about me being defiant as a kid. I don't think I necessarily wanted to define authority. I definitely wanted to define the boundaries of, what was possible. And I was never the kid who wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. I was the kid that wanted to be an astronaut, a fighter jet pilot, climb Mount Everest. I wanted to be an explorer. So skiing kind of showed me what exploring was like, and I liked adventuring. And we went up the lift, and I remember she taught me how to do a turn, and I followed her doing this turn, and it clicked very quickly for me. Another thing about me as a kid, I was never somebody who could learn with lectures. I was a kinesthetic learner, so I learned by doing. So as soon as I did one turn, it didn't take long for me to start doing the turn right every time. And then when I got to the top of the lift, I was just like, I haven't been to that side of the hill yet. I want to check that out. I want to, explore what's over there. And she was just like, we can go that way. She didn't say like, no, you can't go that way. And I didn't know what the black diamond meant. But if you know anything about skiing, I don't know if anyone in our audience skis, a black diamond means most difficult at the resort. They're the hardest runs. So we go down the hill. I popped a ski off and, I had to put it back on. And this is a tiny hill, but when you're a tiny kid, this felt like this grand adventure. Like I'm on this steep hillside. I have to get my ski back on. And then I go down and I'm just kind of doing it. I'm not really questioning it. All the instructors were questioning it. And I know who this lady was because I went on to be a ski instructor there, like I said before. She was actually the director of the ski school. So I ski past this line of people, and I see her at the end of the line, and she like kind of looks down at me because I'm really short. And she's like, did you do that run on your first day? Like, yeah. And she's like, oh my God, nice job. And I see all the other people are looking now. And I look at Dad. I'm like, why is everybody looking at me like I just came back from war?
So what a nice experience though, to be like all that positive reinforcement for you doing something where you're just having fun and feeling most like yourself, right? How beautiful that is, right? So that must have been like a huge like light bulb, right, Rob, for you?
Yeah, and it was the opposite of any other experience I had ever had with him in any place. I mean, he could foment discord anywhere, and that for some reason in that environment, I think ski, the kids are a little bit, he sort of fit in more there than anywhere else, and so. We then the next weekend we went to Wachusett, which in Massachusetts is the biggest mountain in Massachusetts, and it's a legit mountain, I would say. And we get there, it was Martin Luther King Day weekend, and the place is packed, and the lines are like 40 minutes to get on a lift. And I said, this is it. This was fun for a week, and it's all going to fall apart here, and we'll never do this again because he's gonna lose it. I even went inside and I asked if they had a special pass for kids with disabilities. Can I cut this line somehow? Can I pay extra? And the lady looked at me like I was crazy, and I was like, all right. So, but again, he got through it. It wasn't always easy. I mean, he would flop down on the line every once in a while and go on without me, and we're never going to make it. But as soon as we got on the chair, he was happy as could be, and we survived something we wouldn't survive anyplace else, and so that led to Stowe, and Stowe was more challenging in Vermont, and he did his first double black diamond, which nobody does on their fourth or fifth day of skiing, and we had a little conflict over that. It was our first conflict where, at this point, he was better than me already, and I couldn't ski a double black diamond at Stowe. There's no way. And I told him, maybe when you're 12 or 13, we can start to separate, but we can't separate on the mountain. You're 8 years old, 7 years old. I lose you. And so, Ryan, tell the story when you skied your first double black. How I learned my lesson.
Because all of mine have been long, but essentially we're riding the lift, and I want him to keep in mind that had I listened to him, I would have skied my first double black the same year I skied like one of the hardest runs in North America. So thank God I didn't listen to you. We're riding the lift, and I'm like, I want to do a double black. And I had been formulating this plan for months in my head because I knew he wasn't going to let me. And he's like, no, you can't do it. And I told him at the top of the lift, I'm like, I'm going to do it. He's like, yeah, whatever. And then I just kept skiing past the sign. And he was in disbelief, like he just did it. So he skis the trail next to me. I don't even know if he could process that he was going to find me. And I ski out the bottom. And I'm like looking at him like, there you go. I did it.
So I patted him on the head and I said, all right, you can make your own decisions from here on out. And that was true in the East. we then went out to Vail. When you start to ski out west, the resorts are massive. And
Yes.
if we separated, he could be lost for days. So we had a lot of conflict in those early years, especially out west, over things that I just couldn't do. And in fact, and this led to sort of the breakup with the first school. We went out to Vail and he jumped off of a cliff, which sounds, but if you ski, it's something normal that skiers do all the time.
Yeah.
But Ryan, tell the story about what happened when you got back to school and told the story.
Yeah, I skied off a cliff, and if you don't know much about steep skiing and stuff, Vail has these whole areas that they mark off with signs called, extreme terrain, because a lot of skiers like to jump off the cliffs on purpose. It's fun, and when there's good snow on the ground, you land and it's really soft, and it doesn't even feel like you've gone off anything very high. And I actually exploded on the fall. Like, my gear came right off my feet, and some snowboarder came right up to me and was like, "Oh, dude, I wiped out on that one last week too. You got to hike back, get your gear." And I'm just like, "Oh, all right." So this is a normal thing in skiing. So when I got back to school, they did not think it was normal. So we have this little group thing where we all sit in a circle and talk about our feelings. And I was telling them the story. I'm like, "Oh, it was so crazy. Like, it was so steep, and there was this cliff, and when I jumped, I fell, and like all my gear came off." And then they're all looking at me like I just told them that I was playing with a gun or something. They're like, "Ryan, like, you need to understand that is not safe." And I actually had like an emergency meeting. Like, the principal of the school called me into his office, and he's like, "You're wearing a shirt right there that says Dead Man's Cliffs. And I hear that over vacation, you almost became a dead man." And I'm like, not understanding why this is so serious. Like, you guys should meet that snowboarder.
Right. And also, your dad was with you and okaying what you were doing. So it's not like
you're right.
So did they call you?
No, but they questioned my parenting to Ryan. And I heard about that after the fact, and that really irritated me, because here we're having the one good thing in his life and everything, and we're advancing, and he's having a ball, and we're seeing a little glimmer of hope for the first time, and they want to take it away. And that was one of the last straws there. So I'll just advance the story a little bit. Things start falling apart there at the end of that year. He did go back for the fall. And at that point, I said,
third grade? Would that be third grade now?
Fourth, I think. I think it's fourth.
Yeah. Okay.
Fourth. And I said, "You can't restrain him anymore." And they said, "Okay, if we're not going to restrain him anymore, you have to come pick him up every time he gets in trouble." And I said, "Fine. When we get to the point where we would restrain him, you'll come pick him up and take him home for the day." And I said, "Fine." So the first 5 days, they called me within 2 hours, 1 hour. By the fifth day, they called me. I dropped him off. I drove down the street. My phone rang, and they said, "Come get him." And we walked out the door, and that was the last time. We never went back.
You didn't.
And
you didn't.
Never went back. That was it.
Awesome.
And
So
I didn't tell my wife until I called her. "Ryan's not going back. It's not going back." And that was it. So we had a little conflict over that, but she understood. We knew it was coming to an end. It was she wanted to have another place set up before, which was logical.
I get it. But
I
also
reacted
get what you
emotionally.
did. I probably would have done what you did for sure.
Exactly.
I would have.
Exactly.
I've got that Mediterranean in me too. So I would have been like,
yeah, for sure. It's the hothead. And then one part we sort of skipped over. At some point, Ryan had started to talk to a talk therapist, a traditional talk therapist.
Okay.
And she was she hated the school. She's the first one who used the words PTSD and said, "He's damaged from this. You're going to have to unravel everything the school's done, and he needs to get out of there." So I had a little more support professionally than I did before. And so now Ryan's home. It's the fall, and we're looking for another place. We're getting rejected everywhere without even an interview because of his paperwork. He's home all day. We have a tutor a couple hours a day. And then he did two things. At this point, he was starting to video stuff for YouTube. And Ryan, why don't you pick up the story? The couple of things you did, which led to the next stop on your journey.
At this point, my dad had realized I was like a great skier, and we had just figured out that YouTube was a thing. And I was just getting old enough to have like an iPod Touch and to learn about the internet. And we started uploading my ski videos to YouTube under like the moniker Extreme Ryan. So at this point, me and my friend Carl, he was my friend from down the street. We're thinking we're going to be the next big thing on YouTube. And I'm like, "I'm Extreme Ryan, so we should make videos of stunts like during the off season." So I learned about parkour. There was a movie that was really popular called Prince of Persia and the Sands of Time at this point that featured a lot of parkour. So I'm like, I should do that. And I just started jumping off the playground. And we started jumping off of decks and things and videoing it. And eventually I leveled up. I realized that the second story window was only like 3 feet higher than the deck was. I actually measured it with a measuring tape. And I was like, this isn't too hard for me, but it'll look really cool on the internet if, it's like, a 9-10-year-old kid jumping out of a second story window and doing a parkour roll. And then the other one we did that we thought would get us a lot of views was we did real life fruit ninja. So I was just like, this is a pretty simple concept. You take a bag of apples and start throwing them at me, and I'll take the bread knife and just try and chop them up. It's like baseball, but the baseball cuts in half,
Yeah.
So we got in a lot of trouble for that. My sister was bragging about it a little bit at school and probably embellishing. And a principal there pretended to be really interested and was actually taking a lot of notes for child service.
Oh, no. Rob, at any point, were they threatening to take Ryan away from you? Was
so
CPS
that
involved?
led to a DCF investigation, and they came out for a couple of hours.
Something family
Department Children and Families or something. I think it must just DCF. It's got different monikers in different places, but essentially Child Protective Services comes out and they interview him. And Ryan is a very honest person. He never lies. And so I basically told him, you're going to have to lie to this woman. You can't tell her you use the hammer, you use the nails, you use the saw, you have free reign and you climb out in the woods and you explore. Like, you've got to pretend you don't do anything, which was really tough for a 9 or 10-year-old. But he did a good job. We survived that. The talk therapist at this point, she starts to worry us that Ryan's going to hurt his sister. And he's never been aggressive with her. They would fight like typical siblings. But he was going to do something, with a knife or accidentally extreme. And she was going to end up in a hospital. And so at this point, he was on a medicine called Lamictal. And Lamictal was the new hot thing in mental health medicine. It was, he was on a very low dose because it had a terrible side effect called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is this blistering that happens all over your body, and you can die from it. But she put him on a low dose and said, if he has any form of a rash, we'll just take him off. But it has great results. It's going to mellow him out, and it's going to be, a savior. So we put him on this low dose, which we never should have done. She then starts to talk to us about a hospital stay, where she said, if we put him in a hospital for 2 weeks, a mental hospital, they can play with the Lamictal a little in an environment where it's safe, because if he has a side effect or a reaction, he'll be in the perfect place. And it was logical. It made some sense, but they described it in the book as mistake number 3. And this one was a doozy. We never should have done this. So we allow them to admit him to Cambridge Hospital, which had a children's unit. And, once you take a voluntary commitment to a place like that, they have a lot of rights, and they can, petition to keep you if they think they should keep you, or if you want to pull them out. So once we get there, we sort of realize this was a mistake. He doesn't belong here. We're stuck here. And we couldn't get him out. I mean, the doctor there was very aggressive about threatening us and saying, I need 2 weeks to evaluate him. And if you try to pull him out, we'll have to have a different conversation. I mean, she was super
threatening
aggressive.
to take your child, essentially.
Yes, essentially. Yeah.
So the visitation rights, they were going to move me to a facility where they couldn't visit. And at that point, I would have been gone. Once I processed that they weren't coming, that would have been it. I never would have gotten out.
Yeah, we picked a place where we could sleep over, and my wife spent the night there, most of the time, but I spent some nights, and we were almost always there. It was very rare for one of us not to be there with him. And the doctor increased the Lamictal a ton. And my wife is in pharmaceuticals and biotech. She was adamant about not doing this. And we felt like we didn't have the right to say no. So we let them increase the dosage a lot. And when we finally got out of the hospital, they wanted to put him in a CBAT, is a sort of a mental hospital that you can leave freely. And instead, Ryan and I got on a plane the next day and flew to Utah, and we went skiing. And that was sort of the end for me. Like, I'm really getting tired of listening to people.
Yeah, the system is broken. Yeah.
The thing I'll talk about, and this is like, I always bring this point up because like we were really close to the edge at some points, and this was the brush with the edge. We touched the void here and came back. So don't forget, I was so damaged with PTSD from what was happening to me that I was starting to almost be a little bit delusional to what was happening. Like, basically, I assumed that, like, oh, my parents must not love me with, how many times I've told them, like, I'm being hurt here and nothing's happening. And then when I got put in the hospital, they told me it was just going to be for a day.
Oh.
And when I was there for the second day and the third day and I couldn't leave, I was like,
scared.
They're lying to me. This is all part of the plan. They're lying to me.
Yeah. Did you think you had been abandoned, Ryan? Did you think they were holding me back?
I felt like I was getting abandoned. And even though they were there, I was like, why do they keep telling me that it was, it's only going to be one more week, I'm never going to get out of here. And eventually I decided, if they weren't going to take me out, I was going to get out. So I watched this door and I realized the ID window is just big enough. It has an opening that I could fit through. And I watched and I realized the door inside the hospital connected to a computer room that connected to the ID window. And I watched it for about an hour. And then a lady opens the door and I freaking rushed her. And I dove out the ID window and I got into the hallway. And I got into like a break room because I realized I couldn't get into the elevator. It had an additional lock on it. And I barricaded the door and I was like trying to get out a window. I was like, if they're not going to let me out, I'm going to escape, So that only made things worse. But they couldn't tell me what was really happening behind the scenes because I would have freaked out. They couldn't say like, oh, if you don't behave, they're just going to take you, because then I would have freaked out. So they have to lie to me about like, oh, it'll get better. Like, oh, you're almost out. But I just didn't believe them. So we had to traverse this really narrow balance between telling me just enough that I would stop trying to escape, but not telling me enough that I would realize what kind of danger I was in of being taken. It was really rough. And they kept upping my dosage of medication every day. And whenever I acted up, they would just give me meds.
Were they trying to sedate you? Was it sedating medicine?
No, they would give me the dose of Lamictal. So if I had it in the morning and I'd acted up, they would just give me my next dose.
What does it do to your system? What's the result of that medication?
Essentially, it was supposed to be a mood stabilizer. So, at that point, what I was really suffering from was my fight or flight response was all thrown off from the restraints. I had PTSD. And whenever I sensed conflict coming, I would either immediately start fighting or I would try and run as far as I could. So like barricading the door was like part of that fight or flight response. When people ask me like, oh, what happened? Where did it go wrong? I couldn't even articulate what happened, because as soon as I felt the threat, I wasn't thinking about my decisions anymore. I was just making them. I went into just like a complete animalistic state almost. And then when I came down, I felt this immense guilt because I didn't want to act up. I didn't want to have to fight or run, but it would just be my immediate instinct the moment something happened. So they were treating it as though these restraints are supposed to be helping him, and the only reason he can't function is because he must have like some sort of early bipolar or some sort of mood disorder. So they were giving me stabilizers. But what they were really doing for me, since I wasn't bipolar, they were just sedating me. So essentially, when the meds weren't working, they kept giving me more and kept upping the dosage, giving me them at different times, giving them early, late, whatever, until eventually I just had so little energy that I couldn't really do much and I wasn't much of a threat. And then they're like, he's good. So yeah, I got out after a while. Essentially, my dad told me if I was really good, I would get out. So I just started doing good deeds around the hospital. I started we had a roller skating day and I would help people tie their shoes. If there was a kid who liked to tear up paper, so I would find him scrap paper and I would bring it to him. I thought if I just behaved like the best goody two shoes in the whole world, they'd let me out. And once they did, he was like, we're going skiing.
Wow.
And that's the absurdity. I mean, here's a kid who tried to escape from a mental hospital, and then the next day we were on a plane to Utah. I mean, the dichotomy of this.
Totally. Go ahead.
And then Utah went fine. We had a good experience. The one thing I'll say is, 4 or 5 days later, we get on the plane to go home, and he said, "Dad, my leg is really itchy." And I thought it was dry skin or, the sheets or something. And he pulls up his pants and he's got this bumps all over his leg, red rash. And this was the BlackBerry days. So I immediately fire off a message to the doctor saying, I think Ryan is having an allergic reaction to Lamictal. And I'm waiting. And she says, stop taking immediately. And that's it. Stop taking immediately. And at that point I had to shut off my phone. There's no Wi-Fi back then. And should we get off the plane? Should I go to the ER? I didn't, and I just had 4 or 5 hours of just staring at him, making sure his skin didn't fall off. And, and that just gave me more time to think like this, what are we doing? This is crazy. Like they're just letting them hurt this kid. And I just spent 4 days skiing in Utah with him. Like, how damaged is he that he needs to be medicated? If he can travel to Utah, stay in a hotel, eat meals, ski, well, essentially by himself, because he was way better than me at this point. And so we started to really, at that point, I started really questioning things. He ends up in a second school that restrains less, more as a last resort. They did end up putting him on, at this point, lithium and Seroquel, and then which caused a ton of weight gain, which, in the interest of time, I'll skip ahead, but he got a big belly and his face was really bloated. And, for a kid that prided himself on athleticism, it was hard. And I think some of his YouTube comments would be about how fat he was, and I would have to delete them before he saw them. And it was like, it was pretty tough. So then the second school was better. And at this point, skiing really started to advance. He became an elite skier, and he outpaced me to the point where I started to have to hire guides, and we ended up hiring this guy in Big Sky, Montana, named Ben Brousseau, and Ben becomes an integral part to the story. He becomes a mentor and a friend, and I would see Ryan and Ben just relate so well together, and I'm like, he does better with Ben than he does with me, and maybe because Ben just lets him be and lets him, take risks, appropriately and be himself. And I learned a lot just watching them.
Yeah. I think the intention you were telling me before we hit record was, the intention of this memoir of your story, your combined experiences, was just to, in your words, Ryan, just to show how broken the system is, the therapeutic educational system, but also, I think you also had mentioned to me the medical system. You had trusted that therapist, Rob, which I understood, she had said, hey, no, this is a different situation. Why did she recommend putting him in a mental hospital for a couple of weeks? Because she was afraid he was going to hurt himself or someone?
The threat of hurting Abigail was the one leverage
because
that
of the
she
YouTube
had.
videos?
Yes. Yeah. Because of the knife, because she heard about him jumping out of a window, which again, he measured, he knew it was just, we have a funny house. Like our front is really high and our back is really low. And so the second floor isn't that high off the ground, but she heard second floor window.
Got it.
Then she heard like, knife.
Oh, danger.
This kid's going to kill himself tomorrow if we don't do something.
Let me ask you, who is in the system? Who's in these schools? What kind of, diagnoses, who's there?
All types.
Yeah.
So when I went to, I feel like that's where I had the biggest diversity of people there, because it was like I knew a lot of kids at the schools who were like me and just didn't learn well. I knew a lot of kids who had no type of mental health issues or like developmental or anything like that, who just didn't have families. So the second school I was at, they had a residential facility, and a lot of the kids there, they just had nowhere else to go. It was just like their mom was on crack and their dad was absent, and they just got left somewhere. And, that was the only way they were going to go to school. At different schools, sometimes there were more kids with like delays, more kids with, autism or something. I remember at one of the schools I went to, there were kids getting off the buses in like wheelchairs. At a different school, it was a lot of kids who were depressed and, like couldn't be in regular high school, or it was really small environments. They had lots of anxieties. It's a total mixed bag. But I always remembered the kids who, I would listen to their story and I'd be like, why are you here? I would ask them, what are you in for? Like we were in jail. And they'd be like, oh, I threatened my teacher and they said I had to go here for a year and then I could go back. I'm like, damn. And then you'd see that kid there for like 3 years because they would like do one thing wrong. And then in the next meeting, they'd be like, yeah, he's not ready. He has to stay again.
Wow.
Michelle, if you look, a lot of these schools, back in Boston, you remember, they were essentially were reform schools, back in the day for kids who had no place else to go, or really were, either violent or just developmentally delayed and couldn't participate in a regular school. all of a sudden you have this explosion of spectrum-y kids, that's come on in the last, 15, 20 years. And they're being pushed into these places. And it's not well suited for that kind of experience. Those kids are really bright, and they do question authority and can be difficult. And they're almost better off served in like a Montessori type environment where they're allowed the freedom to explore and learn. And I think they're being put in a reform school, which is a top-down authoritarian structure of comply or else.
Right. Which doesn't suit, he used the word, adventurer, like he thrill seeker. Like that's who, Ryan's got all that in him. What, as a parent, and like, I'm just thinking, Rob, with your story, you went to an amazing college, you went to law school, you're very successful, your wife as well, you're in this, lovely suburb. And even with all of that, like you think about the kids, Ryan mentioned who have no parents or parents are on crack. It's like, what do you want people to take away from this? Because, I think all parents, at least if they're like, aware, like, if somebody's addicted to drugs, they have their own challenges, but, somebody who's healthy and well and committed to like giving the best for their family, like, what are you hoping people are going to take away from the memoir?
I think for most of us, if your goal when you start out as a parent is to have a happy child who can go on and lead a meaningful life, that can take many forms. And I think for me, it doesn't really matter now what he does for a living. He's found something he's passionate about. He's going to be great. In some ways, my daughter, who is a very typical child, she's at a great college and she's always been a good student, I worry more about her because I don't know if she's found that thing that she's passionate about yet. And I think it may be a series of like, you might fail at something. I failed at law. I hated being a lawyer and I ended up doing something I liked. I mean, in this generation, I think it's really hard for those kids to find happiness. The phone puts so much pressure on them and it's difficult. That's a far cry from, we met kids in the system that are life has just been totally unfair to them. And I think, I don't know what becomes of those kids. I mean, some of these kids, I think if they just got a break and they had any parental involvement that was positive, they were smart and they were hardworking and they want to do well in life. I think that there's just so many roadblocks for those kids. And those are the saddest stories of all, because in the end, I think, Ryan is a happy ending, right? It's going to be, he really is. I mean, it's an underdog story and he's proven everybody wrong. I'd love to go back and look at some of those kids we met along the way and see what becomes of them. I doubt there's many happy endings, which is hard to hear, but it's the truth. Nobody's going to fix your child. And if fixing your child means they're going to be more like everybody else, then you're wrong to begin with. Allow them the freedom to figure out who they are and be what they want to be. And that doesn't mean you have to medicate them to get them to be like everybody else or put them in a school where they're going to be forced to be like everybody else. It's a tough journey. And I think, life has gotten more complicated for kids at a younger age. And I think a lot of these issues manifest themselves younger because parents are so in tune with, oh my God, he's not excelling in kindergarten. Oh my God, he's not the captain of the soccer team in first grade or whatever.
Harvard's not on the table anymore. Oh no. It's over, right? There's so much pressure. Ridiculous.
It's so much pressure.
I know.
So make the happiness the priority. And if your instincts tell you that a school is wrong or a doctor is wrong, follow your instincts. If I had followed my instincts 10 mistakes ago, things would have been a lot different for Ryan early on. Luckily, I started to follow them later, and it was only because of skiing. And that's where skiing plays in. It gave me an avenue to see a different kid than everybody else was seeing. And it took me a long time to convince everybody else. But had I not seen him on the ski slopes, I don't know if I ever would have clued in, honestly.
He ended up in public, right, by 10th grade?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
And that was great, Ryan. How was that?
Oh, it was fantastic. The instance I always think about is when I walked into the building the first time in public, I was lucky in that my trauma was really specific. I don't honestly know how people who if your trigger is, big crowds or loud noises, like life must be very hard. Mine was very specific to school and just people in those schools hurting me. So as soon as I got to an environment where I knew they didn't do restraints anymore, I was so relaxed. People used to ask me all the time if I smoked weed, and I didn't. I genuinely was so laid back. And it was interesting to see, I met all of the kids who would have been my peers. The people who were the same age as me and went through the traditional track, kindergarten, first grade, elementary school, middle school, high school. And all of them, they thought the school sucked. Like, this is the worst place ever. Everyone's so fake here. And, I never really shared my story because I was afraid of, being outed for it. But I was just looking at them like, you guys have no idea like how nice this is. Like, you guys can go to the bathroom without asking and without getting tackled. Like, I was not complaining about anything. I thought it was the greatest place ever. And I thought anybody who, hadn't, found a way to love it for the freedom it had, like, just hadn't been through it,
I hear that. And what do you want people to take away from your story, Ryan?
What do I want people to take away from my story? I think a lot of people might look at this too linear and see skiing is what saved him. And that's almost my issue with the title in a way, because skiing really, it saved me, but it's not to say that skiing will save everybody. Yeah. This isn't the book that says take your kids skiing. I think my takeaways are, if you're passionate about something, you can get through anything. When I was in the hospital and I was at my absolute worst, Dad told me every day, like, when we get out of this, we're going to go skiing. And just the thought of getting to do what I loved again was what I held on to. And I held on to that through the whole process. And when you find that passion, it'll drive who you're going to be, and it'll fit what your strengths are. And when you find a way to use your strengths and do what's going to make you happy, you're going to find your place in the world. And no matter what your circumstances are, you can find that. And it can be anything. It can be skiing. It can be basket weaving. The other takeaway would be that I think the system is broken. I think a lot of people look at these systems as though they're this godsend, who, takes kids who wouldn't have a place to be and sort of gives them a place. But I don't think it's that simple. It gives them a place, but there's protocols that people follow. It's not like everybody has the best intentions. Some people are just trying to do their jobs, and some people are malicious. Some people are taking their anger out on kids. So once they get there, there's no guarantee that it's going to get better. There is a guarantee it's going to be really hard to get out. So if you think your kid can see it through without having to go through that, I would say keep them out of the system. And I think the system needs to change for the better. I don't think it can stay the way it is.
And you plan to be vocal on that, it sounds like, through your book, and hopefully getting more awareness out of your experience. Yes?
Yeah, I think the more people that read this, the better. I think it's going to shed light on something that has had no light shed on it. My sister tried to bring this up in class when they were talking about social change, and people were like, oh, that's not an important issue. And I think having this account out there and having people read it will show that it is an important issue. But yeah. I don't want it to be like, my cry for how negative it was. And I don't want it to be like a victimhood thing, because it is a happy ending. And I think the other point of the story, like I said earlier, is that passion and, direction in your life can give you a happy ending. So I don't want to run around being like, this place ruined my life, but I also do want to shed light on what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. Thank you for having the courage to do that. And you too, Rob, to share your story, because it's obviously very vulnerable. The book will be out in March of 2023. It's called Without Restraint, How Skiing Saved My Son's Life. You guys can pre-order it. Where is it able to be found,
everywhere.
Rob?
Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Walmart, anywhere.
It's available for pre-order now if anyone wants to dive into, more of the story. But thank you for taking the time to share it, for your vulnerability, for your courage, and wanting to shed some light on these very important issues, especially with the mental health, just issues just skyrocketing. Maybe there's a lot of misunderstood children out there, and maybe there's a different lens to be viewing this. And also maybe we shouldn't always put our trust where, just because somebody's got a degree at the end of their name, it doesn't necessarily mean they know your child best. Like, that's what I take away. You listen to your intuition, your child best, and your intuition is not going to steer you wrong. And from Ryan, I love that passion, can drive you through to get you through anything. I mean, just a lot of important messages today. So thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. I hope you gained some new information or inspiration for your life. That is the essence of this show, is to really wake up to what's possible for you, to reclaim your beautiful voice, and to really learn to love and prioritize yourself. So if you gained any value from any of the conversations you've tuned into, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast player. You can do that right now on your phone. And please do consider leaving a rating and review if you have yet to do so on Apple Podcasts. It's actually how more women can find the show, and I really want to grow a community of women who are loving themselves and living full on. So thank you as always for tuning in, and I look forward to reconnecting with you next Wednesday. Bye for now.